6:35, morning to you. This is Breakfast with Stephen and Anne.
Right, joining us to look through the papers this morning, Benedict Spence and Ella Whelan. A very good morning to both of you. Right, what are we going to start with? Because nearly every newspaper is sort of leading on the same, well, as you can imagine, on exactly the same story. So, Ella, to the Daily Mail.
Yes, and each paper has their own particular slant on interpreting what's happened, with the Daily Mail running with "what the hell have they done?" Essentially highlighting the fact that they say the corks are popping in Brussels and Moscow, and the Tories don't have a clue who should replace Boris, which is, there is this suggestion that with polls showing that the Labour Party is, if not ahead, certainly much further than it ever has been in relation to support across the country, throwing, what Boris Johnson himself in his resignation speech called an eccentric move to throw the country into some form of chaos, whether it's a leadership election or an actual election. All these rumours are still flying around at the moment. Is perhaps a bit dangerous. And the Daily Mail has some pictures of him hugging his family inside and sort of consoling scenes. But there's one thing that they pick up on, which I think is really interesting, which is that there is this row over whether or not he's going to stay or whether he's going to go come October. And it points out that Boris Johnson has told the Cabinet that he would not seek to implement any new policies or make any major changes of direction. So basically, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything. Maybe I'll get married in checkers, but anyway, that's rumours at the moment. But I'm not going to do anything drastic. And while that might sound like, a smooth transition, a kind of the thing that's needed, actually you have to just zoom out a second and say, we're in the middle of several crises, whether, cost of living crises, fuel, things happening in Ukraine. A Prime Minister promising that for months he's not going to do anything really drastic is probably it's not what you want to hear. It's probably, there is a danger to that, which is that, well, what if something drastic does have to happen?
You need somebody who's capable of making
a decisive decision.
Something we need.
Yes, I think that probably only lends fuel to the fire that says he's got to go, because there has to be somebody in charge who is able to meet. We know that things change week by week.
But on that hand, an interim Prime Minister would not be able to make particularly big decisions either, because they wouldn't have the mandate to. So it's a case of expediting the election of somebody new, isn't it?
Yes, and that's the problem. I think that's why the message on the front of the Mail, which is, this whole kind of idea of, they call it party in the grip of collective hysteria, probably has some truth to it, because, if there was ever I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson. I've never really been, and I can't say I managed to squeeze out any crocodile tears for him over the last few days. But there is something important about saying that at a time when a nation is in a series of crises, you have this exceedingly indulgent game of Westminster musical chairs that I think a lot of people outside of SW1 are thinking,
do you think they gave into mob mentality?
Well, I think he definitely was kind of sidestepping blame when he talked about the herd. But that is how the Conservative Party runs. I mean, that is historic. It's almost like a sort of...
Well, it's how all parties run, though, isn't it?
But particularly the Conservative Party has this, lots of the papers talk about the fact that we have this, the Conservative Party has these periods of collective mania where they sort of just, freak out and go off the rails for a while and throw things up in the air. And we know that, there's been Cameron, there's Theresa May, there's Boris Johnson. There's kind of have a problem with holding on to their leaders. And I just think I can't emphasise enough the fact that this really does feel incredible. I mean, it's happened now, so you have to deal with it, but it does feel incredibly indulgent to lots of people. I was on a hospital appointment the other day, and in the middle of a Labour heartland in Hackney, and lots of the nurses who are not diehard Tory voters, we got talking, were saying, why can't they just leave Boris alone? Which was expressing a kind of sentiment of, I don't want to listen to leadership elections for the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, Benedict, there in the Telegraph, you've been looking at the fact that they're saying this long goodbye, however long it takes, leaves the country in a state of paralysis.
Yes, paralysis, I think, is a particularly terrifying thing for you to ever have in politics. I mean, it worked for Belgium, but that's by the by. I think really what we're seeing here is there's been so much speculation actually for months really about Boris Johnson's future, but always the thing that you hear is, well, who's going to replace him? There isn't an obvious choice. Nobody is, it sort of leaps out at you, and I think that in itself is a bit of a failing of the Conservative Party, of the higher-ups in the Conservative Party. Now, If you were being kind, you might say nobody was prepared to sort of put their head above the parapet in the interests of not rocking the boat. They didn't want there to be any sort of, rupture in the party. If you were being a little bit cynical, you might say it's because that person, whoever they were, didn't want to put a target on their back. They didn't want to be the person who, Team Boris went after and, fired the starting gun and in doing so sort of ruled themselves out of the race. But the problem is, now that he is going, we find ourselves, as Ella points out, in the midst of a situation where there isn't somebody to fill the vacuum straight away. There is going to be this sort of protracted period where there are hustings, where there is leadership contests. And you can imagine, partly because there are no obvious candidates that sort of leap out at you, there will be an awful lot of people who run. And that does seem to be the feeling, is that it's honestly, it's almost open season. We had Suella Braverman come out as the first person yesterday. I don't think anybody had her down as a particularly standout person, and yet she's running. Who knows who will decide to and who won't decide to, because that's also the other big thing. Is that
there's always a lot of silliness as well, though, isn't there?
There is.
People who don't stand a chance put their names
and this
forward
is
for tactical reasons.
Yeah, and this is the thing, actually. Right now, the country can't afford to not have a prime minister, a functioning prime minister, for months at a time, but purely by virtue of the fact that there are so many possible candidates. We can't afford really to get sort of bumped into having the wrong one. And, in the interest of just getting one, of just saying, oh, well, you're the most senior person, Dominic Raab, so you can be prime minister. We can't really afford that either, because we do find ourselves in a position where there are any number of issues that require a firm hand on the tiller and require leadership. And the Conservative Party has shown very little of that up to now.
And in terms of those big issues, there's so much going on domestically, Ella, but as The Guardian points out, on the international stage, a huge amount too. And they say that his Mr. Johnson's end is met with glee in Moscow. Which is an interesting line from The Guardian, who were desperate for him to go.
Yes, definitely. They really go into it, quoting Maria Zakharova, who was the foreign ministry spokesman in Russia, saying the moral of the story is, do not seek to destroy Russia. Russia cannot be destroyed. You can break your teeth on it and then choke on them. So, not mincing words from the Kremlin, but the contrast view is that Zelensky came out and said that he was saddened by Johnson's loss. You just spoke to somebody in Ukraine who was talking about the fact that Johnson was always, the one thing that you can say about him is that he, unlike other leaders who were slow off the starting mark to support Ukraine, both materially and also sort of polemically, at the dispatch box, he's a favourite in Ukraine, and he is someone who has done some very good things in relation
frankly,
to expressing
from what we
support.
were hearing just a few minutes ago, they would be rather pleased if he hung on in there.
Yes, they would be. Because, from their point of view, as your guest pointed out, the name of the game is continuity. Is not to have a shake-up. It's to have someone who. I think she used the phrase "the devil, better the devil you know,"
yes, which is
not exactly the best kind of praise. But
we know what she meant.
There is an important question, which is, I'm sort of harking back to the fact that the chaos is not good for us, which is that if you have big questions of whether or not to send more military aid, whether or not to make an even bigger impact in Ukraine, whether to step it back, and each leadership hopeful have very different views on that. So someone like Tom Tugendhat, for example, has, in relation to his history with Afghanistan and things like that, and his approach to China, has, rather unfavourably been called in some circles a warmonger. He's somebody who has a particular position that could affect that relationship. Others have different positions. So that's also it's not just domestic issues at play. The war in Ukraine is a very serious thing to think about when thinking about the next Prime Minister.
It's affecting us all, isn't it?
We're out of time. Benedict, Ella, thank you. We'll catch up with you a little bit later.